Have you ever wondered how dangerous it might be to trust someone simply because everyone else does? What if the person your entire community admires is hiding the one truth no one is prepared to face? And what if the biggest threat isn't a stranger in the dark, but the smiling hero you wave to every morning? These questions might feel unsettling, but they became painfully real for a quiet, close-knit town that believed it was safe from the world's cruelty. This place was small, peaceful, wrapped in rolling hills and soft autumn nights where porch lights glowed like warm beacons. People didn't lock their doors. Neighbors didn't whisper about danger. And at the center of this trust-filled world stood one young man, the golden athlete, the pride of the community, the boy who carried their hopes on his shoulders. He was charming, adored, and worshipped for his success. But admiration can be a dangerous shield, one that hides not just faults, but darkness far deeper than anyone wants to imagine. And in this town's case, that darkness was already awake and watching. It was on one of those crisp evenings that a kind-hearted young woman finished her shift at the local library and began her familiar drive home. She was gentle, thoughtful, the sort of person who always stopped to help someone in need. Her car smelled faintly of old books and lavender, a comfort she carried everywhere. But as she turned onto a quiet wooded road, her headlights caught a sight that pulled her into someone else's carefully crafted trap. A sleek car sat on the shoulder, hazard lights flashing like a silent cry for help. Beside it stood the town's golden sun, frustrated, stranded, helpless, or so it appeared. She didn't hesitate, she didn't question. Because in this town, helping wasn't a risk, it was a reflex. What she didn't know was that the breakdown wasn't an accident, it was bait, and the man she trusted without a second thought wasn't stuck, he was hunting. But how did a simple act of kindness turn into the beginning of a nightmare? And what was the first sign that the town's hero was not who he pretended to be? She slowed her car without a second thought, a small gesture of kindness she had made countless times in her life, never imagining that this moment would seal her fate. As she pulled up behind the stranded sports car, her heartbeat quickened, not from fear, but from simple concern. After all, who would ever suspect danger when the person waving you down is the same young man the entire town praises as a hometown legend? His face was familiar, comforting even, and that familiarity was the deadliest part of the trap. He walked toward her window with a rehearsed mix of frustration and relief, explaining how a flat tire had left him stranded and how his phone conveniently died at the worst possible time. Everything he said sounded believable, almost too believable, each detail polished, each excuse perfectly placed. It was the kind of story you don't question because it fits so neatly into what you expect from someone you trust. But predators don't rely on fear, they rely on comfort. And he knew the power of his reputation better than anyone. She offered him a ride, believing she was doing something good, something decent. The moment he stepped inside her car, the atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly, as if the temperature had dropped. The charm that had guided his every word now faded into something colder, something hollow. Her instincts whispered that something felt off, but she silenced them out of politeness, a mistake countless victims make before danger fully reveals itself. As the road swallowed them in darkness and tall trees closed in around them, she tried to make small talk, unaware that every mile was taking her farther away from safety and deeper into his plan. He spoke less now, his voice flat, his eyes fixed ahead with a predatory stillness she couldn't yet decode. The facade was slipping, and his true nature was starting to seep through the cracks. But what exactly changed inside that car? And when did her instincts realize that she wasn't helping a stranded neighbor? She was trapped with someone who had been waiting for her. The deeper they drove into the winding, tree-lined road, the more the air inside the car thickened into something she couldn't quite name, not fear, not yet, but a quiet pressure that made her chest feel tight. She kept telling herself it was nothing, just the late hour, just her tired mind playing tricks. After all, this was someone everyone trusted, someone whose posters still hung in the high school gym, someone parents pointed to as an example of what their children should become. So why did the silence feel so heavy? Why did his presence suddenly feel wrong? She glanced at him briefly, hoping a friendly comment might ease the tension, but he didn't look back. His expression had drained of the frustrated innocence he showed on the roadside. Now his jaw was clenched, his eyes unblinking as he stared straight ahead. The shift was subtle but undeniable, the kind of shift that happens when a person drops the mask they've been performing behind. Her fingers tightened on the steering wheel as a cold ripple moved down her spine. Something instinctive, something ancient, began whispering that this wasn't a routine favor. This wasn't helpfulness. This was danger. Then came the moment that confirmed her worst, unspoken fears. Without warning, he commented on a personal detail of her life, something he shouldn't have known, something she had never mentioned. His voice was low, calculated, as though he had rehearsed the sentence long before she ever arrived that night. Her breath caught in her throat. It meant only one thing. he had been watching her before tonight. This wasn't a stroke of bad luck or coincidence. She wasn't the person who happened to stop. She was the person he wanted to stop. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears as she realized the trap hadn't begun on the roadside. It had begun days, maybe weeks earlier. She was not helping a neighbor. She was walking into someone's fantasy. When she finally managed to ask why he knew that detail, he slowly turned his head toward her, and the look in his eyes made her palms go cold, empty, predatory, almost curious about her fear. But what was the final sign that shattered every illusion of safety? And how did a simple conversation turn into the first terrifying glimpse of his true intentions? She tried to steady her breathing, forcing herself to focus on the road ahead as her mind scrambled to make sense of the unease crawling beneath her skin. Maybe she misunderstood him. Maybe exhaustion was twisting his words into something darker than he meant. People say strange things when they're stressed, right? But even as she tried to rationalize the moment away, she could feel the truth tightening around her like a silent warning. Something was horribly wrong. The more she tried to speak, the more he seemed to enjoy the way her voice trembled. His replies grew shorter, colder, each one peeling away another layer of the charming boy he pretended to be. When she suggested turning back toward town or calling a tow truck, his head snapped toward her with a sharpness that made her stomach drop. The smile she'd seen earlier was gone. In its place was a thin, calculated smirk that never reached his eyes. It was the smirk of someone who wasn't stranded, wasn't grateful, and wasn't helpless, someone who had full control of the moment and knew she didn't realize it until now. Then came the moment that erased every trace of doubt. He casually reached over and locked the car doors with a slow, deliberate click, the sound slicing through the silence like a blade. "We don't need anyone else tonight," he murmured, not as reassurance, but as a quiet declaration. Her pulse pounded as she glanced at the dark woods surrounding them, realizing how far they had driven, how isolated the road had become. She tried to hide her growing panic with a forced laugh, asking again where he wanted to be dropped off, but he didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back in the seat, studying her with an unsettling interest, as if the real reason he needed her was finally beginning to show. And in that eerie stare, she saw something she had never seen before, not frustration, not desperation, but hunger. He hadn't needed help at all. He needed her fear, her trust, her vulnerability. That was the real destination. But how did this chilling tension explode into the moment she realized she was no longer in control of her own car, her own safety, or her own fate? Her instincts were now screaming, louder than her thoughts, louder than the soft hum of the engine, louder than the calm mask she was desperately trying to maintain. She forced herself to breathe evenly, reminding herself that panicking would only make things worse. People sometimes act strange when they're stressed, she repeated in her mind, but even that comforting lie was collapsing under the weight of his silence. The shift in him was unmistakable now. The charming hometown hero was gone, replaced by something colder and more calculated, something that watched her not as a human being, but as an opportunity. When she tightened her grip on the steering wheel, he noticed, and the slight curl at the corner of his mouth told her he liked it. He thrived on the tension, on the subtle panic he could sense rising inside her. And the worst part was that he hadn't even done anything overt yet. His power came from what he didn't say, what he didn't do. Predators don't always reveal themselves with violence. Sometimes, they reveal themselves with patience. She tried again, her voice trembling despite every effort to steady it. "We're almost near the gas station. Should I pull in?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his head slowly, his eyes drifting over her face, studying the fear she could no longer hide. "Don't worry about the gas station," he finally said, his tone soft but dripping with something she didn't want to understand. "We're not going there." The words hit her like ice water. She opened her mouth to protest, but he reached forward and placed 2 fingers lightly on the dashboard, close enough to her hand to make her flinch. "Just keep driving," he whispered. "I'll tell you where." In that instant, she knew she wasn't the one choosing the destination anymore. Her heart hammered so violently she feared he could hear it. The trees outside blurred into dark, towering silhouettes, and every mile dragged her deeper into a place she didn't recognize, a place she never intended to go. And with each passing second, the illusion of safety unraveled until nothing was left but the terrifying truth. She was alone in a moving trap with someone who had planned this moment far more carefully than she had ever imagined. But what was the moment that shattered the last hope of escape? The instant she realized he wasn't improvising this night, he had rehearsed it. As the road narrowed into an abandoned stretch of forest, the terrifying clarity of the situation began sinking into her bones. Nothing about this night was spontaneous. Every detail, the stalled car, the flawless timing, the dead phone, the remote location, had been arranged with a precision that no unlucky accident could ever match. She replayed their brief interaction on the roadside, searching for anything she had missed, any warning she should have noticed earlier. But that was the genius of his trap. Predators like him didn't rely on brute force at first. They relied on familiarity, on reputation, on the comfort people feel when danger comes dressed as safety. His silence now was no longer awkward. It was deliberate, a quiet reminder that he held absolute control. Her throat tightened as he directed her to take a narrow dirt turnoff she had never seen before. The path was almost invisible, swallowed by shadows and overgrown brush, the kind of place no one would stumble upon unless they were led there. She hesitated, her foot hovering over the brake, instinct screaming for her to stop, run, scream, anything. But he leaned closer, his breath cold against her ear, and murmured, "You're doing fine, just keep going." The calmness in his tone was more horrifying than any threat. Calm meant confidence. Calm meant he knew exactly how this night was supposed to end. Her hands trembled uncontrollably now, her pulse thundering through her fingertips as she turned onto the hidden path. The car bumped over roots and gravel, the forest swallowing them whole. She glanced at him again, hoping for even a flicker of humanity, but all she found was a chilling stillness in his expression, a quiet anticipation. He wasn't nervous, he wasn't surprised, he wasn't improvising anything. He had brought her to a place he knew well, a place chosen long before she ever saw him standing beside that fake breakdown. The realization crashed over her with suffocating force. She wasn't his first. He had done this before, many times, and the moment that truth took shape in her mind, the remaining thread of hope inside her snapped, leaving her alone with the horrifying certainty that she was walking into someone else's practiced ritual, not a mistake. But how did she discover that this hidden path wasn't just a random spot? It was a place he had prepared long before tonight. The deeper the car crawled down that hidden path, the more she sensed the haunting familiarity he had with the surroundings, an ease that no stranded driver should ever possess. He didn't look around to orient himself. He didn't check for landmarks. He didn't hesitate even once. Instead, his eyes stayed forward with a confidence that chilled her more than the cold night air slipping through the cracked window. She realized then that he wasn't discovering this place. He was returning to it. The trees loomed like silent witnesses, their branches arching overhead as if trying to hide what lay beyond. The ground beneath the tires shifted from gravel to packed dirt, worn down by more than just nature. Someone had driven here before, more than once, and the unsettling truth crept into her mind. This was his place. Not a random turnoff, not an improvised stop. This was somewhere he knew intimately, somewhere he trusted, somewhere he had prepared. A faint dread tightened in her stomach as she noticed the way he subtly straightened in his seat, almost as if the darkness around them energized him. She could feel him watching her panic grow, feeding on it. The path ended abruptly in a clearing, small, hidden, and terrifyingly isolated. Moonlight slipped between the branches, revealing faint tire tracks embedded in the dirt, older ones beneath the fresh trail they had just made. She wasn't the first car to stop here. That realization hit her harder than anything so far. She stared at those tracks, her mind spiraling, imagining the people who had come here before her, people who might have trusted him just as she had. He noticed her gaze and smiled, a slow, prideful smile that finally exposed the truth he had been hiding since the moment she pulled over. "You're not the first one who tried to help," he whispered, as if sharing a secret. Her heart plummeted. This clearing wasn't an accident. It wasn't a lucky opportunity. It was a destination he had used before, a place built for disappearing, for silence, for things that were never meant to be found. But how did this chilling clearing reveal the full depth of his past, proof that she wasn't the only one he had lured into the darkness? She stepped out of the car on shaking legs, her breath visible in the cold night air, as her eyes tried to adjust to the eerie stillness of the clearing. The silence wasn't normal. This wasn't the peaceful quiet of nature, but the suffocating hush of a place where terrible things had happened before. The wind didn't move. The animals didn't stir. Even the trees seemed to hold their breath. As she backed away from the car, her foot brushed against something half buried in the dirt. At first she thought it was just a rock, but when she nudged it with her shoe, it flipped over to reveal a small metallic glint beneath the grime. Her stomach twisted violently. It was a broken keychain, rusted, weathered, and far too personal to be lying in a place like this. She crouched slowly, her fingers trembling as she lifted it. A faded engraving peeked through the dirt. It wasn't hers, it belonged to someone else, someone who had been here before. She dropped it instantly, her breath catching as she stumbled backward. Her mind raced, connecting dots she didn't want to see. This clearing wasn't only familiar to him, it held remnants of the past, fragments of other nights just like this one. And as her eyes scanned the ground more desperately, she noticed more irregularities. Scraps of fabric tangled in roots, an earring clasp wedged in the soil, a deep scuff mark on a nearby tree trunk that looked disturbingly like the result of someone trying to claw for help. None of it was fresh. Most of it was old. That was the most horrifying part. Whatever had happened here had been happening for years. When she turned toward him, he was already watching her with a calm delight that froze her blood. He didn't rush toward her or raise his voice. He didn't need to, his expression said everything. He knew she had seen enough to realize the truth, and he enjoyed that moment of dawning terror more than anything else. People always leave something behind, he murmured softly, as if explaining a rule of nature. It's how memories stay alive. Her heart hammered as she finally understood. This place wasn't just a hiding spot. It was a graveyard of forgotten attempts at escape, proof that she wasn't the first, and unless she found a miracle, she wouldn't be the last. But what did investigators later uncover in this same clearing that revealed just how long he had been perfecting his cruelty? Long after that night, when the clearing was finally discovered by investigators, the truth came out in agonizing layers, each one worse than the last. The search teams arrived expecting to find clues related only to her disappearance, but what they found instead shattered every illusion the town had clung to. The ground itself seemed disturbed, uneven in a way that spoke of repeated digging over the years. At first, officers thought it was caused by animals, erosion, or fallen branches. But as they moved deeper into the clearing, metal detectors began to scream with a consistent, unnatural rhythm. Something was buried in the soil, multiple somethings. Kneeling investigators gently brushed away the dirt until small objects began to emerge. A charm bracelet missing half its links, a shoe buckle, strands of fabric trapped beneath layers of compacted earth. None of these items belonged to her. None of them had been reported missing recently. Some of them were years old. That was the moment the search transformed from a missing person rescue into something far more chilling. It wasn't one victim. It wasn't one night, it never had been. The soil samples revealed disturbed layers spaced months, and in some areas years, apart. This clearing wasn't just a place he brought her. It was a place he used, a place with history. A place that whispered the stories of others who never made it home. The veteran officers, hardened by years of difficult cases, felt their stomachs twist as the evidence kept coming. Personal items buried at shallow depths. Discarded belongings weathered by time. DNA traces that didn't match anyone known in the town. They were seeing the work of someone meticulous, patient, and terrifyingly confident. Someone who believed he could outsmart time itself by burying the past deep enough to stay forgotten. But he hadn't counted on one thing, the persistence of guilt in the environment itself. Even the earth eventually gives up its secrets. When the pieces were presented in the early stages of the case, the community refused to believe it. They insisted these items were planted, misunderstood, misidentified, but denial can't stand when the ground keeps confessing. And as investigators mapped the clearing, a horrifying pattern emerged that would later prove beyond doubt that she wasn't a victim of opportunity, she was the next in a long line. But what shocking discovery near his own home confirmed investigators' worst fears, proving that the clearing was only one part of his hidden world. As investigators followed the evidence trail from the clearing back toward town, they had no idea that the most damning discovery wasn't hidden deep in the forest at all. It was sitting quietly, almost mockingly, near the suspect's own home. At first, the search of his property felt routine, even symbolic. No one expected to find anything significant. After all, this was the home of the town's golden boy, the place neighbors admired for its manicured yard, spotless driveway, and warm family facade. But seasoned detectives know that predators often hide their darkest secrets in the places they feel safest. And as they moved from room to room, then from the house to the detached guest area behind it, something subtle began to shift. The guest house was old, tucked behind tall hedges, half forgotten by the family but strangely well kept inside. The floor creaked with age, but the space felt lived in, organized, meticulously arranged, disturbingly private. When an investigator pried up a loose floorboard in the back corner, expecting to find rodents or tools, the entire case took a sickening turn. Beneath the board sat a box. A simple wooden box, ordinary until it was opened. Inside lay a collection of personal belongings sealed in small plastic bags, each labeled with neat handwriting and dates stretching back several years. A driver's license from a girl reported missing 2 towns over. Earrings that matched a teenager whose disappearance had gone cold. Scraps of fabric, photographs, and little objects that seemed insignificant until paired with their dates, a timeline of terror. But the horror didn't end there. Behind the guest house, investigators noticed an area near an old tree where the soil looked softer, unnaturally disturbed compared to the surrounding ground. A ground-penetrating scan confirmed their fear. Anomalies beneath the surface, shaped like shallow graves. The excavation revealed human remains, not just one set, but 2, both linked to long-missing individuals whose cases had baffled authorities for years. Suddenly, everything aligned. The clearing in the woods, the trophies beneath the floor, the timeline, the pattern, the confidence he carried like armor. This wasn't a young man who acted on impulse. This was a practiced predator, methodical and patient, living a double life hidden in plain sight. And the grave behind his home wasn't an accident, it was a monument to how long he believed he'd never be caught. But how did the town react when their beloved hero was no longer just a suspect, but exposed as a serial predator? When the truth finally reached the people of the town, it didn't strike like a single blow, it spread like a slow, paralyzing poison. At first, no one believed the investigators. They couldn't. How could the young man they had celebrated, defended, and proudly claimed as their own be the same monster responsible for the horrors unearthed behind his home? Denial became the town's last fragile shield, a desperate refusal to accept that a predator had been living among them, shaking hands at community events, smiling in photographs, and waving from parade floats as if he belonged to a world built on trust. But as the evidence mounted, the trophies, the graves, the timestamps, the forensic matches, that shield began to crack. Neighbors who once boasted about knowing him now lowered their eyes in shame, whispering about moments they dismissed as nothing. A teacher remembered how intensely he watched certain girls at school. A clerk recalled how he lingered too long in the store aisles, observing people with unnerving focus. A neighbor admitted overhearing late-night sounds near the guest house, but brushed them off because he was a good kid. Every memory the town once held dear transformed into a haunting reminder of how blind admiration can hide the most sinister truths. Parents felt betrayed, confused about how they had allowed their children to idolize someone capable of such cruelty. Elderly residents locked their doors for the first time in decades. Even his closest friends struggled to reconcile the charming athlete they knew with the cold, methodical predator revealed by police reports. And as the media descended upon the town, cameras capturing teary interviews and stunned silence, the community's sense of innocence shattered completely. It wasn't just the crimes that horrified them, it was the realization that he had fooled them all with ease. He didn't blend in despite his reputation. He blended in because of it. That was his greatest weapon. But how did he react when officers finally arrived to arrest him? Terrified, apologetic, or something far more disturbing? When officers finally pulled up to his family's elegant home, no one knew what to expect: fear, denial, panic, maybe even a desperate attempt to run. But what they found instead was something far more unsettling. He was sitting calmly in the backyard, tossing a football into the air as if nothing in the world concerned him. Not the missing woman, not the evidence piling up, not the graves behind his guest house. He didn't flinch when the officers approached. He didn't stumble over explanations. He didn't break into a sweat. Instead, he offered a polite smile, the same charming smile that had fooled an entire town for years, and asked if they needed help finding someone. That was his first response. Not fear, not confusion, not even annoyance. Just measured amusement, as though the unfolding investigation were an inconvenience rather than the unraveling of his entire life. When detectives informed him he was under arrest, he rose from his chair with the smooth ease of someone stepping into a spotlight, not someone facing a lifetime behind bars. His parents rushed to his side, panicked and defensive, insisting there had been some horrible mistake. They demanded explanations, threatened lawsuits, begged for privacy, anything to protect the image they had built around their son. But he didn't look at them. He didn't look at the officers either. He looked straight into the cameras gathering near the front yard. And there, for the first time, the town saw a glimpse of the real man behind the mask, a slight, chilling smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, a look of superiority completely out of place on someone being cuffed for multiple murders. It was as if he believed he was untouchable, still playing a game he assumed he could win. Even when the cold metal clicked around his wrists, he kept his posture relaxed, almost casual, as though the law were merely an obstacle he intended to charm his way around. His arrogance wasn't shaken by the evidence or the warrants or the horrified stares of his neighbors. If anything, he seemed entertained, as if the chase had finally become interesting. But what happened next inside the interrogation room stunned even the most seasoned detectives, not because he denied everything, but because of the way he twisted every detail to display his brilliance. Inside the interrogation room, the temperature seemed to drop the moment he sat down, not because of the air, but because of the unsettling ease with which he slipped into the chair, crossing one leg over the other, as if attending a casual interview rather than facing charges that could end his life. The detectives expected resistance, panic, maybe even feigned outrage, but what they encountered was something far more dangerous: a man who believed he was the smartest person in the room. He examined the walls, the camera, the table, even the detectives themselves, with a cold, analytical gaze, as though he were evaluating a puzzle he fully intended to solve. When the questioning began, he didn't answer defensively or emotionally, he answered with condescension. He corrected their phrasing, he questioned their logic, he smirked at their attempts to establish a timeline. Every detail presented to him became an opportunity to showcase his intellect. It wasn't innocence he was selling, it was superiority. He wanted them to feel inferior, as if they were unworthy of the truth he held so tightly. And the strangest part was that he never outright denied the events. Instead, he reframed them, twisting the language so artfully that his words hovered between admission and mockery. He spoke of unfortunate misunderstandings, of misinterpreted circumstances, and even hinted that the entire investigation was a product of small-town jealousy rather than evidence. But beneath his carefully curated language, something darker seeped through, a subtle satisfaction whenever details of the victim's final moments were mentioned, a flicker in his eyes that revealed not fear but pride. Detectives noticed it instantly. His restraint, his calmness, his arrogance, they weren't signs of innocence. They were signs of someone reliving something he enjoyed, and the more confident he grew in his verbal game, the more he revealed without realizing it. His own words began forming a pattern, one that aligned disturbingly well with the physical evidence already discovered. By the end of the session, the detectives didn't just have confirmation of guilt. They had witnessed the true personality behind the mask, a man intoxicated with control, desperate to maintain the illusion of power even as the walls closed in around him. But his downfall didn't come from the detectives, it came from his own need to display superiority. The turning point didn't explode into the room, it slipped in quietly, disguised as one more attempt on his part to flaunt his intelligence. Throughout the interrogation, he treated every question like a debate he was destined to win, smirking at the detectives as though they were slow students in a class he believed he should be teaching. And then it happened. A subtle but devastating mistake born from pure arrogance. When detectives referenced the staged roadside breakdown, they intentionally described the wrong brand of tire just to see how he'd react. It was a small detail, insignificant in the grand scheme of the investigation, yet he pounced on it instantly. His posture straightened, his eyes narrowed with satisfaction, and he leaned forward with a tone dripping in condescension as he corrected them, naming the exact brand, model, and specifications of the tire that had been found on the abandoned sports car. For a full second, the room froze. He seemed pleased with himself, expecting the detectives to acknowledge the brilliance of his correction. But instead, they exchanged a single glance, the kind of silent communication forged through years of reading suspects. Because only one person in the world could have cared enough to correct a detail that small, the man who staged the scene. His own ego had betrayed him. When he realized it, the confidence on his face flickered, just for a breath, a brief tremor of recognition that he had just revealed far more than he intended. But even then, he tried to recover with smug explanations, suggesting he had simply heard rumors or paid attention to cars. It didn't matter. The damage was done. In that tiny correction, he placed himself at the crime scene more clearly than any witness ever could. It was the kind of confession a narcissist makes, not by admitting guilt, but by believing he is too clever to be caught. And as the detectives leaned back in their chairs, letting the silence tighten around him, he finally understood something he had never believed possible. Intelligence doesn't protect you when your ego is the loudest voice in the room. But his self-destruction didn't end there. What he said next, and how he said it, exposed a chilling truth about how he viewed his victim. After the slip about the tire, the detectives let the silence stretch, giving him room to either retreat into caution or fall deeper into his own arrogance. He chose the latter. Silence, for a man like him, wasn't pressure, it was a stage. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers lightly on the table as if the interrogation were a mild inconvenience rather than the crumbling edge of his freedom. And then with a slow exhale, he began speaking again, not because he was asked, but because he couldn't resist the urge to demonstrate his superiority. He talked about patterns of behavior, about how people react under stress, about how victims misinterpret intentions, using language so detached, so analytical, it stripped humanity from every part of the story. The detectives listened carefully, noting not just what he said, but what he didn't say. He never called her by name. He never referred to her as a person. Instead, he spoke of her as if she were an object in a study, as though the entire night had been a psychological experiment he believed he had conducted with precision. And then, without being prompted, he began correcting the detectives on the timeline they presented, down to the minute. He pointed out small inconsistencies in their reconstruction, claiming they had misunderstood certain intervals. "You're off by about 12 minutes there," he murmured, almost bored. "That's not when she got scared." The room chilled. He hadn't been asked when fear entered the picture. He hadn't been asked how she reacted. He volunteered it confidently, casually, as though reciting a memory he had considered hundreds of times. His voice held no remorse, no hesitation, just the subtle pride of someone revisiting a moment of control. One detective glanced at the other, realizing the truth. This wasn't just a man recounting events, this was a man reliving them. His facade of calm intelligence had cracked wide open, exposing something far more monstrous beneath. He didn't see what he did as a crime. He saw it as a performance, one he believed he executed perfectly. But the most chilling moment of the interrogation wasn't what he described. It was the photograph that finally made his mask slip completely. The detectives had held onto one final piece of leverage, not evidence, not a confession, but something far more powerful, a photograph. When the lead detective quietly slid the picture of her across the table, the room seemed to tighten around him. It wasn't a crime scene photo or anything grim. It was a simple, joyful image of her from months before the night she disappeared, smiling, alive, full of warmth, the kind of picture that radiates who a person is rather than what happened to them. For a moment, the mask he had so carefully maintained flickered. His eyes dropped to the photograph, and instead of remorse or recognition of her humanity, something darker crawled across his expression. Not sadness, not regret, possession. His fingers brushed the edge of the picture almost reverently, as if he were admiring something precious he believed belonged to him. The detectives watched in tense silence, understanding they were witnessing a moment far more revealing than any verbal confession. "She was interesting," he finally murmured, his voice carrying a softness that made their skin crawl. "People like her don't usually stop for strangers. She should have known better." There was no empathy in his tone, only disappointment that her fear had come too late to satisfy him fully. He spoke about her final moments not with grief, but with an unsettling nostalgia, as though revisiting a memory that had given him a sense of power he missed. The detectives let him talk, each word painting a clearer portrait of the predator behind the polished facade. The more he spoke, the more he incriminated himself, slipping into details that had never been released to the public, details only the person responsible could have known. And yet he didn't censor himself, because in his mind this wasn't a confession. It was a demonstration, a display of how easily he had manipulated her trust, the town's admiration, and now the interrogation itself. But the photograph had done something he hadn't anticipated. It exposed the fracture in his ego. The moment he touched her image, he revealed not only guilt, but obsession. And obsession is the one thing even the best criminals can't hide. But when investigators dug deeper into his past, they uncovered something even more terrifying. This wasn't the first time he'd targeted someone like her. As investigators widened their search beyond that single night, a disturbing pattern began to emerge, one that stretched far beyond the town's borders and deep into the years before he became a local celebrity. It started with small inconsistencies in his past, things that never seemed alarming at the time. A classmate who suddenly transferred schools after a misunderstanding, a visiting student who left campus without explanation, a missing hiker whose last known location placed her uncomfortably close to where he often trained alone. Each incident on its own seemed unconnected, but when placed side by side, the coincidences tightened into a chilling mosaic of predatory behavior hiding in plain sight. Detectives traced his footsteps through old yearbooks, social media posts, and campus security reports, noticing a recurring pattern. He often appeared near places where young women reported feeling watched or followed, but no official action was ever taken. His charm, his reputation, and his family's influence made any suspicion evaporate before it could solidify. People dismissed their discomfort because he was too nice, too successful, too admired to be dangerous. And that was precisely what he relied on. When investigators contacted former acquaintances, the stories began pouring out, whispers of unsettling encounters, strange comments he made when he thought no one was paying attention, moments where his friendliness shifted into something sharper and more intrusive. A former classmate broke down while recounting how he would stare at her for minutes at a time, expressionless, as though studying a puzzle only he could see. Another remembered waking up during a school retreat to find him standing near her bunk, claiming he was just looking for the bathroom, though it was on the opposite side of the building. None of them had reported him. None of them wanted to cause trouble for the star athlete. And that silence, that unwillingness to believe someone so admired could be dangerous, had allowed him to refine his methods for years. The deeper investigators dug, the clearer it became. The crime in the clearing wasn't a sudden eruption of evil. It was the product of years of practice, years of testing boundaries, years of manipulating people into trusting him. He had built a life where suspicion never touched him, because admiration shielded every red flag he waved. But the investigation was about to uncover the first undeniable proof that the clearing had not been his beginning, a discovery that tied his past victims directly to him. The moment that shifted the investigation from disturbing suspicion to irrefutable certainty came when forensic analysts matched the soil found in his car to the exact composition of the earth in the hidden clearing. It was a rare combination of clay, decomposed pine needles, and mineral traces unique to that specific patch of forest, a match so precise it erased any possibility of coincidence. But the soil wasn't the only thing that condemned him. Embedded deep in the rubber seam of his passenger side door was a single strand of hair, so fine and faint it almost escaped detection. Under the microscope, its fiery color and unique structure confirmed what everyone feared. It belonged to her. That strand didn't drift into his car by chance, nor could it be explained away as an accidental transfer from town. It proved she had been inside his vehicle, that she had sat where he claimed no one had been. And beneath the seat, wedged between the metal tracks, investigators found a faint smear of dirt matching the clearing's soil once again, lodged in a place that suggested a struggle took place inside. But the most chilling discovery was a long, shallow scratch on his forearm. He dismissed it as an injury from football practice, but forensic experts saw it differently. The angle, the spacing, the depth, it was consistent with a defensive wound, the kind inflicted when someone fights for their life in close quarters. His story about a practice accident fell apart the moment investigators compared the wound to similar marks on confirmed victims in past cases. Every piece of evidence, the soil, the hair, the scratch, the unmatched fibers found on his jacket, began to converge like 1,000 threads weaving a single horrifying truth. He hadn't just crossed paths with her, he had been with her. He had taken her, and he had expected to walk away untouched, just as he believed he had done in the past. But evidence doesn't care about reputation. It doesn't care about charm or family power or the illusion of innocence he so carefully curated. Evidence remembers everything a criminal hopes the world will forget. And now, the physical proof that once lay hidden in the shadows was speaking louder than his denials ever could. But if the evidence was damning, his reaction to being confronted with it was even more revealing, because instead of breaking, he doubled down on his arrogance. Part 19 uncovers how he tried to manipulate the courtroom, and how the cracks in his confidence finally began to show. When the evidence was finally presented to him, the soil match, the hair strand, the forensic analysis of the scratch on his arm, the detectives expected at least a flicker of panic, maybe anger, or even a desperate attempt to explain it all away. But instead, he did something far more unsettling. He laughed. Not a full laugh, not a loud one, just a quiet, dismissive exhale through his nose, as if the evidence that tied him to the clearing and to her was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. His arrogance didn't crack, it intensified. He leaned forward, hands folded as if he were the one evaluating the detectives, and called their findings coincidences, misinterpretations, and the kind of forensic dramatism people fall for on television. He insisted that soil transfers happen all the time, that hair strands cling to fabrics randomly, and that scratches mean nothing without context. In his mind, he wasn't defending himself, he was teaching them, offering a condescending lecture on why they were too unsophisticated to understand the flaws in their own evidence. Even in the courtroom, he carried that same bravado. When prosecutors laid out the timeline, he smirked as if their work bored him. When photographs of the clearing were shown to the jury, he tilted his head and whispered something to his attorney that drew visible irritation from the judge. He behaved not like a man fighting for his freedom, but like someone convinced he was still in control. He even attempted to charm the jurors, smiling at them, making eye contact, adjusting his posture to display confidence. Older jurors looked away, uncomfortable. Younger ones stiffened, but he wasn't reading their reactions. He was reading his own reflection, lost in the delusion that charisma could override evidence. It was his fatal flaw. He believed the trial was a stage, the audience was adoring, and the truth was malleable under the weight of his personality. What he didn't realize was that his arrogance had begun to wear thin. Jurors weren't impressed, they were disturbed. Each smirk chipped away at whatever doubt remained, turning suspicion into certainty. And still, he kept performing, unaware that the mask he believed was unbreakable was already cracking at the edges for everyone to see. But the moment that truly shattered his illusion of control came not from the evidence, but from a fellow inmate who exposed his darkest secrets. While prosecutors meticulously built their case in the courtroom, another truth was quietly forming behind bars, a truth that would strike harder than any forensic report. For weeks, he shared a cell with a man who had seen every kind of criminal imaginable, someone who knew the difference between guilt, fear, and ego. And from the very first night, the inmate realized something chilling. This wasn't a man terrified of getting caught. This was a man irritated that others had disrupted his work. At first, he barely spoke, maintaining the same aloof superiority he displayed everywhere else. But narcissists don't stay silent for long. They need an audience. They need admiration. They need someone to understand their brilliance. So gradually, almost proudly, he began talking, not about his innocence, Not about being framed, but about strategy, planning, and his ability to read people. He spoke as though describing a hobby. His cellmate noticed how his voice changed when he discussed fear, how he claimed he could sense it before they even knew they were afraid. And every night, as the jail settled into uneasy darkness, he talked more. He described the clearing, the late-night drives, the patterns he observed in victims. He spoke with a cold detachment, as if reciting technical notes from a project rather than recounting human suffering. The cellmate listened, horrified, realizing this wasn't just a confession, it was boasting. He even corrected himself mid-story at times, refining details not because he feared incrimination, but because he wanted accuracy in how his cruelty was remembered. The most terrifying moment came when he leaned back and admitted that each act gave him a rush nothing else in life could match. He said hurting people made him feel powerful, finally seen, in his words. That was when the inmate understood. This wasn't a man who stumbled into evil. This was someone who chased it. When prosecutors later received the inmate's detailed account, they didn't treat it as gossip. They treated it as the final missing piece, the psychological blueprint of a predator who didn't regret his crimes, he relished them. But if his arrogance in jail exposed his pride, the next phase of the trial exposed something even darker, a chilling attempt to charm the jury into doubting their own instincts. When he finally stepped into the courtroom for the official trial, he didn't walk in like a man accused of murder. He walked in like a man arriving at an awards ceremony. His posture relaxed, his suit immaculate, his expression composed in that familiar, unsettling smirk that had hypnotized the town for years. And from the very first moment the jury saw him, he launched into a silent performance designed to undermine everything the prosecution had built. He made soft eye contact with jurors, especially the ones he believed were more impressionable. He nodded politely when they entered, smiled faintly when they looked his way, and even adjusted his tie in a way that suggested confidence rather than desperation. It was a calculated act, a psychological game meant to plant seeds of doubt. He wanted them to think, could someone this calm, this intelligent, this charming truly be a monster? He had used this tactic his entire life, weaponizing likability as a shield against suspicion. And for a moment, a few jurors seemed unsettled, not because they believed him innocent, but because his demeanor was so profoundly at odds with the horror of the charges. But charm only works when people want to believe in you. By now, too much darkness had been revealed. His downfall in the courtroom wasn't the evidence, it was his own behavior. During testimonies from experts, he doodled on a notepad, glancing up only to smirk when something contradicted his narrative. When the victim's family entered the room, he didn't lower his gaze or shift uncomfortably. Instead, he looked at them with a cold curiosity, as though studying their grief for amusement. At one point, when the jury was instructed not to look at certain photographs due to their graphic nature, he leaned slightly to catch a glimpse, his lips curling in a way that made even seasoned officers stiffen. His charm began to rot in real time, revealing the arrogance beneath it. And as witnesses described his past behavior, his patterns, his disturbing habits, the jurors didn't see the clean-cut athlete anymore. They saw the predator behind the mask. His charisma, once his greatest weapon, had finally turned against him. But the moment that doomed him entirely happened when he made the worst decision of his life. Taking the stand, his attorney begged him not to do it. Every legal expert warned that putting a narcissist on the stand was a disaster waiting to happen. But he insisted, not out of strategy, not out of fear, but out of ego. He believed no one could represent him better than he could represent himself. He believed that if the jury could just hear his voice, see his confidence, and recognize his intelligence, they would crumble. And so he stepped onto the stand with the confidence of someone preparing to give a motivational speech rather than defend himself against charges of murder. He spoke with smooth, measured words, painting himself as a misunderstood genius, the victim of a community too simple to grasp his complexity. He accused investigators of incompetence, suggested the evidence was fabricated, and even implied that the victims had been reckless for trusting strangers. His tone was so detached, so self-satisfied, that the courtroom felt colder with every passing minute. At first, a few jurors listened carefully, evaluating his poise. But the longer he talked, the more they saw it, the subtle cruelty in his phrasing, the pleasure he took in describing how people misread him, and the way he slipped into past tense when referencing things he claimed never happened. Then came the fatal mistake. Under pressure from the prosecution's cross-examination, his calm facade began to fracture. The prosecutor purposely misstated a small detail, the placement of a particular object in the clearing. Instead of ignoring it, he snapped, correcting her sharply, and in doing so, revealed knowledge he should never have possessed. The courtroom went silent, the jurors' heads lifted. Even his attorney closed his eyes, knowing exactly what had just happened. In that single correction, delivered with icy arrogance, he confirmed he had been there not because any witness saw him, not because any camera caught him, but because his ego couldn't tolerate someone getting a detail wrong. Desperation crept in after that. He rambled, contradicted himself, shifted blame wildly, and at one point scolded the prosecutor for not understanding how fear works, unintentionally describing the victim's emotions with chilling accuracy. His attempt to save himself hadn't just failed, it had exposed the truth more clearly than any piece of evidence ever could. But the single moment that sealed his fate, the moment no juror could ever forget, came when he let one damning sentence slip from his own mouth. The prosecutor knew he was cracking, and she pressed just a little harder, not with accusations, but with calm, deliberate questions designed to trap a man who loved the sound of his own intelligence. She brought out the small silver locket that belonged to the victim, holding it gently between two fingers so the jury could see it glint under the courtroom lights. She asked him plainly how it ended up buried on his property. His attorney stiffened. The jurors leaned forward. He hesitated for the first time since the trial began, his jaw tensing as he searched for a lie that would sound intelligent enough to satisfy his ego. He finally said the detectives planted it. The courtroom murmured. The excuse was weak, but the prosecutor didn't challenge it. She simply tilted her head and asked, "Planted it, after you took it from her." And that was the moment everything collapsed. That was the moment arrogance overtook calculation. He snapped. "I didn't take it from her," he barked. But then, without thinking, without catching himself, he added, "I threw it away before any of this happened." A sound rippled through the courtroom, a collective intake of breath, sharp and stunned. Because the locket had never been described publicly. No one had ever said it was thrown, dropped, or removed from her body. Only the killer could have known its final location or its path there. His attorney's head fell into his hands. The jurors froze, eyes wide, the weight of his words sinking in like an anchor through water. He tried to recover instantly, backtracking, stammering, insisting he misspoke, but the damage was irreversible. His voice, once so confident and controlled, suddenly trembled with frustration, his sentences tripping over each other as he attempted to untangle himself from the trap he had built with his own mouth. It didn't matter. There was no coming back from the moment he revealed knowledge he should never have had. For the jury, this was no longer a question of whether he was guilty. It was a question of how long he had been hiding the truth, and how many lies they had allowed him to spin before seeing him clearly. His downfall was not the evidence, not the testimony, not even the behavior that had unsettled everyone for weeks. His downfall was the one thing he treasured most, his own voice. But the courtroom would soon witness something even more chilling, not from evidence and not from him, but from the heartbroken mother who finally stood to speak when the verdict was approaching. The judge allowed the victim's family to address the court, a moment meant to honor grief, provide closure, and give voice to those whose lives had been permanently broken. The room fell into a heavy, almost reverent silence as her mother slowly rose from her seat. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't shouting. She moved with a quiet strength that made even the bailiff straighten in respect. Every step she took toward the podium carried the weight of a life forever divided into before and after. When she finally stood facing the man who had taken everything from her, the courtroom seemed to shrink, pulling all eyes toward the sorrow etched into her face. She didn't speak like someone giving a statement. She spoke like someone opening a wound that had never closed. Her voice was soft but unwavering as she described her daughter's kindness, her dreams, her laugh, the small routines that had once filled their home with warmth. The jury listened, tears gathering in their eyes, realizing that they hadn't just been judging evidence, they had been judging the theft of an entire future. But the most powerful moment wasn't in what she remembered, it was in what she lost. Her voice cracked only once, when she recounted the last words her daughter said before leaving that night, promising she'd see her in the morning. Every person in the room felt the ache of those words. They felt the cruelty of a promise stolen. And then, as the mother lifted her gaze toward him, the man shackled to the defense table, something horrifying happened. Instead of remorse, instead of averted eyes, he looked back at her with a bored, almost irritated expression. And then slowly, deliberately, he yawned. Not a nervous twitch, not an accident. A full, exaggerated yawn, as if her grief were an inconvenience, as if the memory of her daughter bored him. Gasps rippled across the courtroom. A relative lunged before being restrained. Even the judge's voice shook with fury as she slammed her gavel, struggling to regain order. That yawn was more than disrespect. It was a confession of character, a final, definitive revelation of the monster behind the mask. But the trial was not over yet. One final moment, one final voice, would decide whether he walked away with a sentence, or a lifetime of silence. When silence finally settled over the room after the outburst caused by his cruel yawn, the judge's expression transformed into something no one in the courtroom had ever seen from her before. Judges are trained to remain composed, controlled, emotionally distant, but even she could not disguise the fury burning behind her eyes. She called for order, her voice shaking not from fear, but from disgust. Then she turned her attention fully toward him, studying him the way one examines something poisonous. This was the moment he had been delusional enough to believe he could manipulate with charm or intellect. But after that act of contempt toward a grieving mother, the courtroom no longer saw a defendant. They saw exactly what he was, and the judge was prepared to speak for every person he had hurt, deceived, or destroyed. Before announcing the sentence, she allowed him the chance to speak, a legal formality she clearly dreaded granting. He stood slowly, smoothing his jumpsuit as though preparing to issue a grand speech. But what came out of his mouth wasn't remorse. It wasn't accountability. It wasn't even denial. Instead, he delivered a final act of cruelty so deliberate it sent a visible shudder through the gallery. He recounted her daughter's final moments not with sorrow, but with a twisted satisfaction, mocking the mother's grief by repeating the last words she wished she could forget. His voice dripped with malice, savoring the emotional destruction he inflicted in real time. It wasn't a statement. It was a weapon, a last chance to feel powerful, a final attempt to carve himself into the nightmares of the people he could no longer control physically. Gasps, sobs, and cries filled the courtroom as he smiled, actually smiled, at the devastation he caused. That was it. That was the moment the judge's restraint evaporated. Her voice thundered through the courtroom as she delivered the harshest condemnation the law allowed, multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole, stacked one after another, guaranteeing he would die behind steel doors and concrete walls. She called him a danger to humanity, a void of empathy, a man who had forfeited his place in the outside world forever. For the first time since his arrest, the smirk vanished. And in its place came the dawning realization that his reign of manipulation was over. But even after sentencing, the story wasn't finished, because someone unexpected stepped forward with a revelation that exposed an even longer history of violence. Just when the courtroom believed the story had finally reached its end, when he had been sentenced, escorted away, and stripped of every illusion of superiority, a quiet figure rose from the back row, stopping everyone mid-breath. She wasn't part of the trial. She wasn't listed as a witness. No one even knew her name. But the moment she stepped forward, a tremor of recognition crossed the prosecutor's face, the kind of recognition that comes from seeing someone who has lived through something unspeakable. Her hands shook as she introduced herself, her voice soft but steady, carrying a weight that silenced even the judge. She said she had once known him, not as the town's star athlete, not as a charming public figure, but as a predator. And what she revealed unraveled the timeline the investigators believed they understood. She told the court that years earlier, she had been walking alone late at night when he pulled up beside her with that same friendly smile the town adored. He told her his car had stalled, just like he had told the others. He asked for help in the same gentle voice everyone trusted, and she, like so many before and after her, believed him. She climbed into his car. She remembered the shift, the chilling moment when his face lost all expression and his voice dropped into something cold and practiced. She described the same hidden road, the same suffocating darkness, the same calculated steps he used to corner his victims, but unlike the others, she escaped. Not because he let her go, but because a passing patrol car inadvertently interrupted the nightmare long enough for her to run. She had lived with the memory for years, convincing herself no one would ever believe her. After all, he was untouchable, the town's pride, the golden boy. She left the state the next morning, carrying the trauma in silence. Her story shattered any lingering doubt that his crimes were recent or impulsive. This wasn't a descent into darkness. It was a long, deliberate pattern. A career of violence hidden behind trophies, newspaper headlines, and a carefully polished smile. She was the survivor who slipped through his fingers, the one he never forgot, and the one whose courage finally exposed the full scope of his brutality. But even after her revelation, investigators uncovered one final truth, a chilling pattern of evidence that proved he had been hunting far longer than anyone realized. Her testimony opened a door investigators didn't expect, because once they knew he had been targeting women long before the known case, they returned to old files with fresh eyes. Reports that once seemed unrelated now formed a chilling pattern. Missing person cases in nearby counties, unexplained disappearances along rural highways, hikers who vanished without a trace, all clustered around periods when he was known to be traveling, training, or attending events. At first, these connections seemed circumstantial, but patterns don't lie. And as investigators sifted through years of overlooked clues, a shocking timeline emerged. He hadn't simply escalated in recent years, he had been refining his methods for nearly a decade. They discovered anonymous tips from frightened girls who reported being followed by a man in a car eerily similar to his. They located old surveillance footage showing him circling parking lots late at night, long after legitimate reasons for being there had evaporated. More disturbing still were the interviews with former acquaintances who recalled moments that once felt weird but harmless, the way he memorized women's routines, the unsettling questions he asked, the lingering eye contact that made them uneasy. None of them had told authorities. They didn't think they had a right to accuse someone so admired. Then came the physical evidence, items buried deep in the woods, in areas he frequented long before the victim in the main case. Objects belonging to women who had never been linked to him before suddenly matched locations he visited regularly. A map found in his belongings had seemingly random markings, but when plotted by investigators, the points formed a pattern that overlapped with several unresolved disappearances. And the most horrifying realization was that he had created comfort zones, specific places where he felt safe enough to stalk, abduct, and hide evidence. Places he returned to again and again. This wasn't a man who snapped under pressure or acted impulsively in a moment of rage. This was a practiced predator who built an entire life around the thrill of hunting without being caught. He didn't fear the law, he believed he was smarter than it. He didn't fear suspicion, he hid behind admiration. He didn't fear consequences, he assumed he'd never face them, and for years he was right. But justice doesn't stop with a conviction, and the public had one final question. How did a man so admired fool an entire town for so long? Part 28 reveals the first of 3 reasons why justice always catches up to even the most famous criminals. The question echoed across the nation long after his conviction. How could someone so admired, so publicly celebrated, fool an entire town for years? How could a community built on trust overlook the warning signs staring them in the face? The answer begins with the first reason justice always catches up to famous criminals. Arrogance always becomes their downfall. People like him don't just believe they're smarter than everyone else, they believe they're untouchable. Praise becomes armor, popularity becomes camouflage, and admiration turns into a shield that lets their darkness grow unchecked. For years, he relied on this shield. He relied on the smiles people gave him at grocery stores, the applause echoing through stadiums, the adults who bragged about knowing him, the teenagers who idolized him. He fed on their trust because it made him feel invincible. He believed his charm could rewrite truth, and that his reputation could bend reality. And for a long time it worked. Teachers excused strange behavior. Coaches dismissed reports of discomfort from female students. Neighbors ignored their own unease because they didn't want to believe that danger could look so familiar, so polished, so successful. But arrogance is a trap that eventually collapses on itself. The same confidence that allowed him to lure victims blinded him to the subtle traces he left behind. He thought he could stage a scene perfectly, yet he left soil in his car. He thought he could manipulate timelines, yet he corrected details only the killer would know. He thought he could read fear, yet he failed to see the fear in the jury's eyes wasn't toward him. It was for the victims he tried to erase. His arrogance made him sloppy. His arrogance made him careless. And in the end, his arrogance made him speak one sentence too many. That is the first truth about criminals who rise on reputation. The higher they climb, the harder they fall, because eventually, their confidence blinds them to the trail of evidence they leave behind. No mask, no matter how charming, can survive the weight of its own ego forever. But arrogance is only the beginning. Even when criminals believe they've erased every trace, the truth has a way of resurfacing. The second reason justice always catches up to even the most celebrated criminals is brutally simple. Evidence never forgets, even when people do. Unlike emotions, reputations, or public opinion, evidence has no loyalty. It doesn't care how admired someone is. It doesn't care how charming, talented, or influential they appear. Evidence quietly records the truth, piece by piece, waiting for the moment someone finally looks closely enough to see the full picture. And in his case, that picture was far more damning than he ever anticipated. For years, he counted on the world looking the other way, on people dismissing their instincts, ignoring the uneasy moments, and failing to connect the clues scattered throughout his double life. But evidence doesn't disappear just because a community refuses to see it. Soil clung to his car, fibers clung to his clothes, scratches marked his skin. Victims left behind small traces of their final fight, desperate fingerprints of their will to survive. Even the forest remembered him, documenting his footsteps, his tire tracks, his buried secrets. He believed he had crafted a perfect illusion, but the physical world quietly preserved his truth long before investigators arrived. And when they finally connected those silent witnesses, the the keychain in the clearing, the graves behind his home, the hair trapped in the car door, the inconsistencies in his timeline, the illusion shattered. Evidence doesn't care about charm. Evidence doesn't bend under persuasion. Evidence doesn't bow to reputation or influence. It simply waits. And when the time comes, it speaks louder than any alibi, any lie, any carefully polished facade. His downfall wasn't just the confession he accidentally blurted in arrogance. His downfall was the trail he left behind every time he believed no one was watching. Because someone was the soil, the fibers, the digital timestamps, the scratches, the items he thought were hidden forever. Evidence never forgets the truth. It simply waits for courage, persistence, and the right pair of eyes to finally uncover it. But even evidence alone doesn't close a case. There's one final force that brings justice crashing down on criminals who believe they'll never be caught. The final and most powerful reason justice always catches up to even the most untouchable criminals lies not in arrogance, not in evidence, but in something far stronger than both, the persistence of victims and the loved ones who refuse to let their stories die. Criminals like him believe they can bury the truth the same way they bury their crimes, deep, hidden, forgotten. But families don't forget. Survivors don't forget. Communities don't forget once the truth begins to crack open. It was the mother's determination that kept investigators searching beyond dead ends, pushing past doubts, refusing to accept vague explanations. It was friends who noticed something wasn't right. It was neighbors who replayed old memories and began to uncover the lies woven between them. It was the survivor who stepped forward after years of silence, carrying trauma she never wanted to speak aloud, yet spoke anyway, because she knew someone else's justice depended on her truth. These voices, trembling but unbreakable, formed a force he could never anticipate. Every unanswered question, every sleepless night, every tear shed at a missing person vigil became fuel for the relentless pursuit of answers. Criminals believe victims disappear the moment they silence them, but they don't. Victims speak through evidence, through families, through communities, through every person brave enough to refuse the easy path of forgetting. And that is why justice eventually crushes even the most protected predators. Because love is stronger than lies, grief is stronger than manipulation, and truth is stronger than the arrogance of someone who thinks he can outsmart an entire world. In the end, he was not undone by detectives or courtroom procedures. He was undone by the voices of those who refused to let his darkness overshadow the light he tried to extinguish. Justice caught him because people cared enough to keep looking, and they cared long after he believed they'd given up. That is why no criminal, no matter how admired, can outrun the truth forever. And that is the haunting reality of true crime. Monsters hide in plain sight, but truth hunts them in silence until the moment it finally strikes.